thank you so much. It's such a fantastic audience for a Friday afternoon, so I'm already just thrilled. I think we've already had a very successful event. Many thanks to Aaron. I just started as a non-resident senior fellow, so this is my first event at FPRI, and this is a great way to start. As he mentioned, I direct the Penn Project on the Future of U.S.-China Relations at the University of Pennsylvania, where I also teach various courses on history, Chinese history, Chinese law, U.S.-China relations, and you'll see in the audience a number of my students in the field. They're all here. I should just mention, because it's my first time doing an FPRI event, and some of you I know are longtime stalwarts, that I'm actually from the Philadelphia area. I grew up in Radnor Township. I went to Episcopal. My third grade art teacher, Mary French, is back there. And Reverend Jim Squire is back there, who I've known both of them since I was probably about 8 or 9 years old. So anyway, this is your life moment for me. But enough about me. So today we're talking about Hong Kong. The last 10 years have been incredibly dramatic for Hong Kong in terms of not only the protest movement of 5 years ago in 2019, the protest movement of 10 years ago in 2014, the ongoing crackdown that continues to this day on many of the things that had made Hong Kong distinctive. Lots of stories that we can continue to read about exiles from the protest movements of people within the Hong Kong legal community, journalistic community, who are being tried under various kinds of charges as mainland China has exerted a much more forceful hand in the governing of Hong Kong. At this particular moment, I think there's a lot that remains uncertain, but it is clearly a different Hong Kong than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And it's not just important on its own terms, but as we think about what's happened in Hong Kong over the past 5 or 10 years and what may be happening onward, there's going to be a lot of relevance for other parts of the world in which you might have similar kinds of dynamics. A lot of people are thinking about what are the implications for Taiwan, but also what is the story in Ukraine connoting about when a country exerts this kind of force over another country. Of course, Hong Kong is not exactly the same as Taiwan or Ukraine. Hong Kong is under the sovereignty of mainland China, but as we will explore with our distinguished panelists today, there is some complexity there that is also relevant to those stories of Taiwan and Ukraine and other parts of the world. I could not be more delighted that as our main interlocutor tonight, we have Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom from the University of California, Irvine, where he's the Chancellor Professor of History, but also holds courtesy appointments in law, political science, and literary journalism. Among many other accolades, one thing that I particularly want to highlight about Professor Wasserstrom, I may call you Jeff a few times, but we'll start off formal. About Professor Wasserstrom is that he is an incredibly prolific public intellectual. So his academic rooting is extremely strong in the discipline of history, but he has taken it upon himself over these many decades to also speak very much to issues of the day, rooted always in his academic perspective. And that's really, I think, something very laudable for those of us in the academic world who hope that we have some engagement with the rest of the world. And on this particular topic, he's been very prolific. His book, Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink, published in 2020, which you can see here, was one of the first studies to deal with the 2019 protests as they were happening. And further to the right, someone who clearly needs no introduction for this group, but I will give her one anyway, Trudy Rubin, the foreign affairs columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, member of the editorial board, stalwart of the Philadelphia foreign policy community, who to this day continues to get her own flak jacket and fly to Ukraine and report from the front. She's one of the most incredible figures in Philadelphia, and of course, a long time involved in FPRI. and a friend of mine who we get to hang out from time to time. So I'm absolutely delighted that she is happy to join this conversation. So we're going to try to go for about 30, 35 minutes, maybe a little longer, with a bit of discussion amongst us here. And then we'll open it up to have a discussion with all of you. And just to kind of jump into it, the first question that I will pose to Jeff on my right here, a lot happened 5 years ago. A lot happened 10 years ago. A lot of us were talking about it at the time, like how do we interpret what's happening? But now, if you want to tell the story as a historian, what does the 5 years ago protest movement look like? What does the 10 years ago protest movement look like? How do you tell that story today from today's vantage point?
Great. Thanks. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. And I've been here before, and to talk about an earlier book, China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know. And for the This Is Your Life moment, my co-author on that, Mara Cunningham, is here. And we talked about this together. And I thought of that also, that it's gone through 3 editions. And one edition was after 2014, we said, like, what do we need to add? It's a question and answer book of commonly asked questions, short, snappy answers. And in the revision process, it was, well, we've got to bring Hong Kong in. And the 3rd edition came out in 2018. So if we do a 4th edition, one of the first things will be, we need to bring Hong Kong in. So this is great. This can be the dry run for what that answer would be. What would 2019 mean for Hong Kong? Going back to 2014, and just very briefly, because I am a historian, back to 2012, and back to 1997. In 1997,
Let's go back to the 19th
century. No, I won't go back to the 19th, much as there are interesting things there to go. Now, in 1997, Hong Kong became part of the People's Republic of China during a deal, which I refuse to say it went back to being part of the People's Republic of China, because it never was. And it was never part of a China, it was part of the Qing Empire, but it was then under British colonial rule for a long time. But in 1997, much of the land of Hong Kong was leased for 99 years. The 99-year lease ran out in 1997. A deal was struck that Hong Kong would go back under something called One Country, Two Systems, which was that Hong Kong would be part of the country, but would be able to have its separate way of doing things. And ever since then, there's been a fight over what exactly does a separate way of doing things mean. What everybody's agreed is the economy would be different. And I think from Beijing's point of view, all along, that was really what it was supposed to mean. But for local people in Hong Kong, it also meant civic life would be different. The court system would be different. The press would be different. The education system would be different. And you had a series of protests in the 2010s that were essentially people taking to the streets because they thought that one of these pillars of what made Hong Kong different was under threat. In 2012, there was a proposed change to the education system that would bring mainland-style patriotic education into the city. In Hong Kong, and to a certain extent Macau, which is a similar setting, it was the only place in the People's Republic of China where children grew up learning about what happened in China in 1989, learned about the horrors of the Great Leap Famine, learned about the massacre on June 4th, 1989. So some students took to the streets and said, we don't want to have this kind of what they saw as a kind of brainwashing and an erosion of something they cared about. And they won, which was quite amazing. The government backed down. The government in Hong Kong was trying to sort of ingratiate itself with Beijing, and this was something they thought would work, and they backed down. In 2014, 10 years ago, I've gotten there was another round of protests. And this was because there was still this feeling, people were nervous about what felt like mainlandization. It felt like over time, there was, even though there was supposed to be this protection of Hong Kong having its own way of doing things, as long as the chief executive was elected through a kind of not really an election, a selection process, where the only people who could run for chief executive, top official, were ones that had been vetted by a small group of people and were agreeable to Beijing. So they said Hong Kong was supposed to be able to choose its own leaders. And instead, what was happening was that instead of a leader being imposed from London, there was one that was not imposed from Beijing, but had to be somebody who would work with Beijing. So there was a big protest led initially by some older intellectuals and a reverend, and then students took to the streets and basically took the momentum of the movement. It was an Occupy movement. This is the era of Occupy Wall Street. In the wake of that, it was also right after there had been an Occupy movement in Taiwan that really influenced the young people in Hong Kong. And so there was this effort to shut down the central part of the city, and there were Occupy zones in other parts of it. It was an amazing event. It lasted for 79 days. It failed to achieve a change in the electoral system, but it dispelled any notion that was lingering that the Hong Kong people were apathetic, only cared about money, wouldn't devote themselves to something. It was the biggest social movement, sustained social movement in any part of the PRC since 1989. So it was a big deal, and but it did not move the needle on electoral things. So then some things kept happening where people felt the pillars of what really protect but really make us different are under threat. In 2019, there was what seemed a small matter, an extradition law that would allow people who had committed a crime that the mainland wanted them to be tried for on the mainland would be taken out of the Hong Kong court system and tried on the mainland. And on the mainland, there's a 99% conviction rate or so, and there's very little chance of being out on bail. In Hong Kong, Hong Kong never had elections, never had full democracy, but it did have a fairly well-established rule of law, independence of courts, and a variety of things. People would be, if you were arrested for protest on the mainland, you might just disappear. If you were arrested for protesting in Hong Kong, you would be out the next day talking to the press on bail. And so you could tell this was really different. And the people thought that this was really not the thin edge of the wedge, but the kind of if this went through, this was the start of the erosion of a separation of powers, a separation of the legal system. So there was a much bigger movement than there had been before. In 2014 and in 2019, when there were these movements that were bigger than had ever happened before, there were also police actions that were more virulent and more violent than ever before. And in 2019, there were also thugs who were leading with the government that beat people up. And that then led to a ratcheting up of the protests. They became more militant. The police used more violence. The police didn't kill people. There was no massacre. There was a kind of intentional effort to not do anything that would give the same kind of global bad press that Tiananmen had. But there was enormous uses of tear gas, and there was tear gas set off inside subway stations and other things that you're just not supposed to do. There was shooting people with rubber bullets. There's an idea of causing as much damage to people as possible without actually killing them. The movement went on, lasted longer than, became the biggest by far sustained social movement since Tiananmen. By some reckonings, one of the biggest protest movements in the history of the world. If you look at per capita, if you look at close to 2 million people on the streets of a place with 7.5 million people, it actually dwarfs things that we think of as really giant protests in American cities. And then it was crushed, and a combination of COVID and that led to a break in public activities, but then the imposition of a national security law from the mainland that really did away with any notion of a kind of separate legal system. There's still remnants of that old legal system there. And so for me, in some ways, if we think about implications for other parts of the world, for me, the main implication of all of this for America, and it's changed the way I actually think about politics, is that separation of powers, which is what's disappeared there, is one of the most crucial things that allows a degree of liberty to exist. As much as the tendency in looking at Tiananmen and then looking at the Hong Kong protests today, it was a fight for democracy. By the end in Hong Kong, it was really as much about the fight for some kind of rule of law and separation of powers. And that's really what's disappeared.
So let me ask just a follow-up question, and then I'll turn to Trudy. So you did a very nice job of kind of condensing in a short amount of time this sweep of history with a few major inflection points that everyone should really focus on. One being the handover in 1997, which there may be some discussion about whether it had to happen. It goes back to a very interesting history in the 1980s of the negotiations between Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher's government. But in any case, the handover did happen. And it happened under this idea that at least for 50 years, there would be one country, two systems. That even though sovereignty was being returned to mainland China, that China would maintain some degree of difference in Hong Kong in terms of the traditional social rights, legal rights, political rights. I actually was in Hong Kong in 1997 on the day of the handover. I just graduated college and I got to be there. And I remember there was an enormous amount of concern, like what's going to happen? Are Chinese tanks going to roll in? You know, and it was actually relatively benign. None of that happened. And in broad terms, it seems like at least for those first 10 years, 15 years, it was one country, two systems. Exactly when the turning point happens, I think could be a matter of debate, but certainly these last 10 years, accelerated by these protests, it's hard to make the claim that today is one country, two systems. So the question that I want to ask you know, as a historian, when you think of like, did things happen because they were going to happen regardless? And little things here and there just kind of maybe accelerated it or decelerated it? Or are these particular inflection points truly important in changing the course of history? So if the 2014 protests hadn't happened, or if the 2019 protests hadn't happened, would we be in the same place today? Or were they going to happen regardless because the equilibrium of one country, two systems was never going to, like, how do you see that from today's vantage point?
So one thing I left out, in 2003, there was an effort to bring in a new security law to ramp up kind of controls of sedition. There was a big protest then, and the government blinked. So there were a couple of times that gave people the idea that maybe there would be a tussle back and forth, but maybe there was always going to be space for some negotiation. The time that the one country, two system worked best, the kind of last golden moment, I think, was the 2008 Olympics. And this illustrated it so beautifully. Beijing allowed some of the equestrian events to be held in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has horse racing as one of the things that separates it out. And so people could cheer for the national team and also take a kind of local pride in being part of that. And I know some young Hong Kong activists who say, like, I just don't understand. I was so excited by that. I felt that I was part of something that could celebrate. And then the eroding of things came there. A variety of things happened that, this is I don't really believe, I believe heavily in contingency and the way that history can surprise us. There are things like that there were delays on tightening of controls in Hong Kong early on because Beijing wanted to become part of the WTO. And if there had been like the dire scenarios had happened, that would have been global news and would have hurt them doing that. If there were a different kind of regime in Beijing at different points along here, there would be different kinds of pressures between it. So it's much that there are just so many variables in that. In 2012, if you'd asked me in 2012, will these protests work by these teenagers led by, a 15-year-old or so, Joshua Wong then, what are the odds that they're going to succeed and getting, you would say, pretty low, and yet they managed to. So they're keeping these kind of surprising things. And I think this is true. I mean, this is the issue of, like, some people say, what did people think about when they were on the streets in 2019? They know what this regime can do. What were they thinking? I'd say the same thing to people who took to the streets in East Germany in 1989. When you would say, we've done this before. They've tried to protest in East Germany, and each time the tanks roll in. Haven't people been paying attention to what happened in the history in 1968 and what happened in Poland, solidarity? Sometimes these things work. So I do think that what happened in 2019 sped up the degree of the repression. I think COVID, also a distracted world and the ability to impose things in the name partly of public health as well as other things, help things happen, move faster. I do think that by the period when the protesters began protesting, there was a steady tightening of controls that showed up sometimes in subtle ways. It wasn't just out of the blue. There was the extradition law. There was a high-speed rail station that was brought in from the mainland to Hong Kong, and PRC, the mainland security, were put in control of that station. So again, you have something like, I love the East German example. Checkpoint Charlie is now controlled by the Stasi. You know, are things starting to change? So people have this feeling of inevitability. And I don't think that if there hadn't been protests, Hong Kong would still be in an easygoing kind of clearly one country, two systems thing under a Xi Jinping.
Trudy, so you were on the ground, I think, in both periods, both in 2014 and.
I wasn't there in 2014. I was there in 2016, 2018, and 2019. And each time I interviewed all the pro-democracy people, I was on the campus of Polytech U, which is the campus that exploded the most dramatically. I have photos of all the beautiful Molotov cocktails that the kids were making. They actually, when you see them all laid out in milk bottles with the gasoline in, but with beautiful colored rags sticking into the gasoline, it's quite aesthetically lovely. And I'll get to that. I mean, you know, I just want to comment on the bigger picture, and I will come around to Poly U because I think it tells a lot about what happened in the end. So, you know, I first went to China in '86, and that's the first time I went to Hong Kong. And I am not a China scholar, but I've been, you know, periodically every 3 or 4 years. And I think what happened to Hong Kong has two bases. The taking of power by Xi Jinping and the emphasis in the whole democracy movement in Hong Kong on rule of law. I mean, for those of us who are facing an election in less than 2 weeks, in which rule of law is suddenly a huge issue in the United States, it's painful and heartwarming and hurtful. As I was looking over my notes from 2019 with Martin Lee and Joshua Wong and Nathan Law and Jimmy Lai, to see the devotion which and the deep belief in rule of law. I mean, as Americans now more and more who don't like Trump think about the Constitution as the basis of our country, well, rule of law was what everybody talked about, even on every trip. And even when the British was still there, Martin Lee would talk about a distinguished barrister and founder of the democracy movement would talk about rule of law in Parliament because they could always appeal to Parliament. There were a lot of lawyers involved. And even when I was on the Poly U campus, a lot of the students there were not college students. Most of the college students had gone home, but there was a call put out on Telegram, come, we need people. And most of the kids there were high school students, incredibly frightened, incredibly brave high school students. And what did they talk to me about? Rule of law. I mean, these were 15 and 16 and 17-year-olds. And a lot of what they talked about came from their civic education. And they talked about the under pressure from Beijing. In Hong Kong, the attempt to change the curriculum had failed back in 2003, but by 2019, surreptitiously, the government was already trying to institute patriotic education and rule out civic education. So they talked about education and they talked about rule of law. 15-year-olds who were scared out of their wits because the campus was surrounded by police cars. So to me, it's rule of law and it's Xi Jinping. Now in the 1990s and into the aughts, as many of you know as well or better than I, rule of law had a brief flowering as an issue in China. And in the 90s, it was incredible. I mean, Ford Foundation had rule of law programs. Peking University and Beida had programs where law students took their laptops and went out to the countryside to read peasants their rights when development companies tried to take their land for nothing. They were shown how they had the right to complain because they were owed compensation. So there was all kinds of talk, even after Tiananmen. A lot of the Tiananmen people who survived went sort of underground into the bureaucracy and worked on rule of law. I don't think that Xi was oblivious about the rule of law movement, and it was ended. There was talk about village elections moving up to town elections. There were civil servants sent to Taipei to look at how elections had been brought in after the dictatorship of Chiang Kai-shek, brought in by his son, and then developed further by Li Dongwei. And so rule of law for a while was a hot topic in China, and then it was ended. And rule of law was anathema to everything that Xi Jinping wanted for Taiwan. It was causing him big problems, but certainly for Hong Kong, where there were more levers to be pulled. So the 2014 demonstrations were about the fact that 10 years on, I think it was 10 years on, there was supposed to be full universal suffrage, which the democracy movement interpreted to mean that they had full control of picking the candidates for the chief executive and voting. And pressed by Beijing, the Hong Kong government set up a vetting system, which meant you'd never have universal suffrage. And then by the time you got to 2019, or let me just stop one stop before, in 2016, there were some demonstrations. Why? Because I talked to Joshua Wong about this, about the failure of the umbrella movement. And what he said is what we learned from it is we can't achieve everything all at once. We have to go into the electoral system and work our way up. So the first step was to run for LegCo, the Hong Kong legislative body. And they worked their butts off, and a lot of democracy movement people were elected to LegCo. So then what happened? Beijing insisted that several of them be kicked off. It claimed they didn't take their oath of office correctly. So it then not posthumously, after the fact, it charged some of the people from 2014 and banned them from running for office. So you already had the repression of rule of law. And this extradition bill was seen as the next step in crushing rule of law. But then what happened is the crackdown was so vicious that police were beating students. There were police stations out in the boonies of Hong Kong where students were being taken and terrorized. And in fact, one student was killed, although it was a little mysterious still in 2019. But this student was pushed off of a garage floor. And the way he landed on his head, it could only have been if he was dropped. The government claimed suicide, in which case his legs would have been broken. But no, he was murdered, and that caused a huge uproar. So the demonstrations also spread because not only was rule of law the mantra, but the police were supposed to act according to the law. And so the demand of demonstrators was a commission to look at violations of rule of law, both by the police and by some students who had become violent. So, all right, I will start with only two quotes that I want to read you. So, Joshua Wong had been in the U.S. Arguing for the passage of the Hong Kong Democracy Act in the United States Congress, which ultimately passed, I think a year later, it passed in 2019. It was when Trump was president, he actually signed. And he came back, and then all of this was happening. And I was sitting with him in a restaurant, and some people came over and started screaming at him and calling him a traitor and a bastard. And he said, you see, there's a lot of people here who don't want rule of law. But even though he was under charges for 2014, and these demonstrators were being beaten up, and it was clear that this was not going to end well. He said, I'm still optimistic. Without the umbrella movement, we wouldn't have 2019. We know what it means to stop fragmentation and be more organic. I still think we can get more legislative power. And so the movement leaders, such as they were, and in 2019, there were not clear leaders like there were in 2014. This was a big problem. It was basically an organic demonstration without clear leaders. But having been stopped from moving into LegCo, they were going to organize and run in district elections. And the hope was they could get a majority and show China that rule of law could not be pushed back. Well, ultimately, the district elections were canceled. And I talked to Jimmy Lai at his home, and he was very worried about the violence. There were demonstrators called frontliners, and they were throwing Molotovs at police. And he was afraid Beijing would use this. And so he said, you don't get universal suffrage without long-term resistance. But he was he said, Beijing want the kids to commit atrocities to turn the public against them. And he also said that the Hong Kong Democracy Act would not help them. It only raised morale. It would give a great sense of encouragement in terms of moral support. This whole thing is a fight for different values. All right, so Jimmy Lai has been in solitary confinement for 3.5 years now. Nathan Law escaped. Jason Wong is in jail for God knows how long. And I think that the overall message is they never had a chance. That what they stood for, values, which Jimmy Lai kept talking about, it's one set of values here, another set in Beijing. Those were values that Xi Jinping had to crush. And those high school students that were on the campus, they were toast. Everyone who left finally, when the police let people leave, their names were taken. and they had no future in Hong Kong. Now, these kids were calling me because I had to go home to Taiwan. I was getting calls all day long. They were so frightened. I got them a lawyer, but a lawyer couldn't really help them. Their principal came to Paulie Yu, he was Lenny, and he led them out, but their names were still put on the list. And I often think, what happened to them? There were 3 girls and 2 boys. They have no future in Hong Kong. And now patriotic education is taught in every school. But what they did and what they fought for, maybe in 20 years when Xi Jinping is dead, but as long as he's around, it was like fighting for democracy under Russian occupation in Eastern Europe. It's not going to end well for those people with the courage to do so.
That's great. There's so much there. So let me pull out a few threads and then ask you both a few rapid fire questions so we can maybe get to audience questions pretty quickly. So one of the very, I think, useful themes that I can pull out of your remarks, Trudy, is what is the world we've lost over the last 10 years? And I would summarize it as a world in which one country, 2 systems in Hong Kong had some meaning to it. At the same time that there were developments in China that were in some ways moving away from the most strict authoritarian rule. And when we were in that window, which is roughly from 1997 to about 2010-ish, you could plausibly tell a story about one country, 2 systems being true in Hong Kong, and also a beacon for some of the reform dynamics in China that had some reality to it. So that's the world we've lost over the course of the last 10 years. We've lost it certainly in China for the reasons you mentioned, but especially for tonight's program, we've lost it in Hong Kong. So let me ask a few rapid fire questions here. I'll first go to Jeff on this question. So Trudy's talked a lot about how there was this, democracy movement within Hong Kong that was articulating a lot of their claims in the language of rule of law. But ultimately, what they were pushing for was some kind of democracy, some kind of greater pluralism. And I do think it's important to just be clear that that movement did not start after 1997, that movement started under British rule in the 1960s. The worst rioting in Hong Kong before 2014, 2019 was in the 1960s against the British. The British did bring in this very kind of elaborate legal system, but they were not interested in democracy. And if anything, it was as authoritarian in the 1960s and the 1970s as it is today. When it became clear that Britain was going to hand over Hong Kong, that's when they introduced the types of democracy reforms that then the activists are trying to pull on later. So if people were to say the British introduced a poison pill into Hong Kong once they were letting go of it, is that fair? Is that a fair critique? How would you respond to that?
So I would say, actually, I'm glad you brought up the 1960s. I was going to call this book Hong Kong on the Brink. And then it turned out there was another book called Hong Kong on the Brink. And it was about 1967. So Hong Kong has been on the brink before. So you brought that up. I think keeping these different registers in mind is very important. And I think one of the reasons why in 1984, there was an idea that the transition could happen. And there wasn't more of an effort by Britain to keep it, is you've got to realize that was a time when China, under Deng Xiaoping, seemed to be moving in this liberalizing direction. And so there's this idea that it could be that these countries wouldn't be that far apart. I mean, I would say that, colonialism has a lot to answer for, but I think it is more tightly controlled now than it was under, I think this is a more, in some ways, more rigid form of colonialism. It's another form of colonialism in the sense that the power is wielded by people in a distant capital. That's one of the metrics of a nearby colonial power in Beijing rather than a far off one in London. There was no democracy at that point, but there was some degree of separation. You would have some legal rights. There was also some element of the press, even though it was very tightly controlled. I think the press also is another thing to throw in there. One of the things that One Country, Two Systems, when it was working, was it was night and day when you looked at when you read the news in Hong Kong, where you talked about the private ability to just have certain kinds of discussions that people value about your situation. So yes, there was a way in which the British eased things up when they were about to give it over. That's certainly true, but there's more to the story than that. I would just like to correct one thing. This was a wonderful presentation, but it also highlights the unpredictability of things. They didn't cancel the district elections in 2019. I was sure they would. They held them, and there was a Democratic sweep.
They delayed them a year, didn't
No.
Oh,
They
then I'm
delayed.
misremembering.
No, they delayed the next LegCo election.
Oh, okay.
But I was sure they would stop. They were going to have this election in November of 2019, and I was sure they'd just be canceled, and they had it. And the Democratic forces swept, which was one of the reasons why just nothing was going to go. These were the lower level ones. The LegCo the next year was canceled, but
They did something to crush it, though.
well, they never let people really have take office. But this is just the unpredictability of those moments when we did that. That as it was going, it kept seeming this would die out. It kept seeming it would end. But when you brought up the police commission thing, I think there were 5 demands during the movement, including for the end of the extradition law. It was tabled, but there was also a call for an investigation of the police. It was the refusal to do that led to people who were not necessarily completely in line with the movement, but really felt that the onus for the violence was on the other side. And if there had been a police investigation, even if there'd been a call for an impartial thing, I think the movement would have ended. But that was what was clear. The demise of One Country, Two Systems, really, if you wanted to pick one moment, it was a refusal to say that the police could be investigated. The British sometimes did investigate their own police. Not that there wasn't police brutality, but there was an idea of different mechanisms in play that you could have criticism of it. And that's what was true in Hong Kong up until 2019 and was not true afterwards.
Rapid fire question for Trudy. So as we think about why China was open to some level of one country, two systems for at least the period from 1997 to 2010, leading into the dynamics that we've been talking about in this program tonight. Jeff mentioned China's entry into the WTO, wanting to kind of like play nice into that lead-up process. But another variable that I think has some reality to it is messaging vis-a-vis Taiwan. So in that same period, China is conveying to Taiwan, we can do this. We can have you come under our sovereignty, but you get to still have your own system. We're doing it in Hong Kong. And clearly, that message is a lot weaker today. And it's been reported that the top leadership is aware of that. They understand that the cost of their approach to Hong Kong is that the messaging vis-a-vis Taiwan, hey, look, we're going to do one country, two systems, is much weaker. How do you interpret that? Why do you think the Chinese leadership was willing to incur that cost, that soft messaging to Taiwan of, hey, we're doing it here. We're going to give you, you're going to have your own system. We'll just be technically sovereign. Why do you think they decided, we don't care about that anymore. We're going to crush Hong Kong, and that's the message we're going to send to Taiwan? Because
Xi Jinping had been in power already for 7 years. And everything changed in 2012, but it took a while for it to really show how much it had changed. I mean, when I went from Hong Kong in 2019 to Taiwan, the standard refrain was one country, two systems is dead. And that is the standard refrain now. since 2019. But for Xi Jinping, I think his attitude is we're going to get it back one way or the other. And you know, I'm not sure, trying to scroll my memory back, how far the shift in Chinese military development had gone by then, but it was no longer the period when Bill Clinton could send, you know, aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Straits. And so clearly, there wasn't even plan B, there was a plan A, you know, if Taiwan doesn't bow, we're strengthening our military ability, whatever plan A, B, and C is, blockade, cyber war, and all of the rest of it. And the West is less able to stop us. And therefore, we don't need to pretend anymore.
One more rapid fire for you, one more for you, and then we'll open up to you. So rapid fire for you.
We need to go to questions.
Yeah, we'll go. We'll just very quickly, we'll just do one more, and then we'll open it up. So the last rapid fire for you is how would you describe what Hong Kong is today and the possibilities for the future after all of these dynamics that we've talked about? Understanding that Hong Kong is still different from mainland China. It is not legally the same thing to be accused of a crime in Hong Kong or mainland China. It's getting closer, but it's not exactly the same. There's more space for academics in Hong Kong than in China. Is that just meaningless, or does it mean something? Like, what is that world?
I think it's that the key thing about what's happened since 2020 is we had in our minds the idea of a sudden crushing moment, a kind of Tiananmen moment, and that was the wrong thing. There's been a throttling rather than a single death blow to a place. So you've just got to watch how long certain things can exist. The internet is still freer in Hong Kong. That's important. There is still the Hong Kong Free Press. There's a little bit of space for press, more than in the mainland, and there is more space at universities. But the question is that there's a kind of steady erosion of things, and it's been a very interestingly patient strategy. Things change very quickly, and then they change very slowly. The dragging out of the court cases is also, I think, it's a feature, not a bug. It's partly this idea of having the world be distracted. And I think the reason why it's important to keep talking about things like Hong Kong is I think attentiveness does slow some of the erosion. That if you don't talk about these things at all, then it makes it easier for the space for academics to disappear. If you say it's important that Hong Kong still at least be a bit different, the best way to argue that is to pay attention to what's happened rather than to say it didn't really change that much. I mean, you can focus on how many the zones are, but you can also focus on how many of them are disappearing. And if you tell it as a story of gradual disappearance, it took there were all sorts of things you thought might happen right away. There were statues related to Tiananmen. We're still up a year later after things happened, but then they disappeared. There were there were some administrators of Hong Kong universities who were protective of the kind of academic freedom of their faculty. The regime has partly waited them out, and when they leave, they're replaced by people who are less able to defend. So it's a story of throttling and erosion. So it is still different, but how different for how long is a different question.
And the last question for Trudy, then we'll open it up and we'll go till 6:45. So there's plenty of time for people to raise points from the audience. US power in this story. We were very active in condemning what happened in 2014. We were very active in condemning what happened in 2019. We've passed legislation. We've sanctioned Hong Kong officials. But it happened. All of this happened. So is there any takeaway here about what the US can or should do in stories like this?
You know, in principle, I'd like to see Hong Kong brought up, the Democracy Act referred to, and so forth, just to keep alive the names of the dissidents who may die in prison, just as Navalny's name was kept alive, even though it didn't say. I, given the uncertainty of whether we would even move to save Taiwan, which is truly a question mark now, I don't see much we can do for Hong Kong, given their geography and their dependence on the mainland. However, I will say one thing in terms of the bigger picture. After an era in which the former countries behind the Iron Curtain, if we can remember that phrase, were liberated, whoever would have imagined that Russia would be rebuilding the Soviet Empire and trying to bring them back behind a curtain, i.e. a new Yalta agreement with the United States, where there was a whole swath of former Soviet republics which are under Russian control. And what I wish is that what happened to Hong Kong would be seen more as an important message of what happens when the biggest country in terms of size and determination to be number one wants to ensure that what it sees as its empire stays under its control. And then think also of what it means for Russia to be trying to take back. They've got Belarus now, they're trying so hard with Ukraine. And to me, it's almost unbelievable what is happening in occupied Ukraine. I've interviewed people who've escaped. It is horrible. And it is like the worst days of Soviet control of Poland, Czechoslovakia. Anyone who pops their head up, who speaks the language, I don't need to go into this because you're not here for Ukraine, but goes to the basement and then is likely deported to Russia, never to be seen again, because there's no listing of what happened to all the people who are being deported. And even one 27-year-old woman, Ukrainian journalist, who secreted herself into occupied territory and was captured, was just murdered in a prison called Taganrog, where POWs are being held. And I've talked to women, not from Taganrog, but another prison who met Taganrog. They are beating women to death in Taganrog prison. And this 27-year-old who was supposed to be exchanged was beaten to death the week before she was, we assume, we can't know, but suddenly she was dead. So I pray that this won't happen to Jimmy Lai. Supposedly he's in very bad shape and he's not getting the medications he needs. He may not be beaten to death, but he may well die. But what happened to Taiwan, what happened to Hong Kong, to me, is an illustration of what happens if these empires are allowed to try to send out their tentacles again. And maybe it was an inevitable with Hong Kong, but I think it's a lesson that just has to remind Americans of what era they are in, because this is not your father's world.
Okay, so we're going to take some questions just so that we get as many voices as possible. I think I'll take like 4 at a time. If you need to go, don't feel compelled, but we will go till 6:45 and we'll take 4 sets of questions and then see if you want to respond. And I think we can do 2 rounds. So I see one hand here. I see one hand back there. Professor Della Pena. Do we have anyone else?
Chelsea's dad.
Chelsea's dad, my student's dad. Is that three? Anyone else? Okay, so we, who was first? Right here. And Trish, please briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Harry Ho. I'm a student at Swarthmore College. Appreciate both of you coming here. I'd like to ask about U.S. foreign policy and the United States' posture towards democracy with, I guess, two pieces of context in mind. The first is Jake Sullivan said that the U.S. foreign policy should not be focused on regime systems changes anymore in China. And the second piece of context is there's a lot of questions about democratic backsliding back home here in the US. Rule of law is being challenged and our justice system is being pushed. Where should domestic and foreign policy makers put their energies with these two pieces of context in mind?
Professor De La Pena?
Yeah. Let me preface my question by indicating that for 4 years, from 1996 to 2000, I was the American Bar Association designated liaison with the Hong Kong Bar Association. I went there during that transition period. And people were very hopeful at that time about one country, two systems. There were, you know, Martin Lee, of course, and others were working to expand the freedoms. And I visited Hong Kong a number of times between then and 2014, and then I didn't go again until 2023. And I was, to put it bluntly, shocked at what I saw in 2023. First of all, the number of foreign faces visible anywhere that I went in Hong Kong were far fewer than they had been. And secondly, the people I spoke to were downright pessimistic about the future in a way that I had not experienced in Hong Kong before. Now, I've read bits and pieces here and there about this company or that company relocating its headquarters. Is that happening on such a massive scale as my impression suggests?
Chelsea's dad.
I'm actually struck by what I just heard. Struck by what I just heard because I used to have an office in Hong Kong, and I remember I always used to come away from Hong Kong thinking, oh my gosh, one of the great things is that young people always say tomorrow's going to be better than today. I mean, there was always such a great sense of optimism. It was after the handover, but before all the changes. But I guess what I wanted to ask is, when we talk about China and Hong Kong, and as awful and terrible as things have been and for dissidents, if we think about it in terms of a US context, if this was a piece of what the United States felt was its territory, and there was another system, let's say communist system, literally in a place which the United States felt was, let's just say for the sake of argument, it was part of Texas or part of New Mexico, would the United States behave any differently?
Well, we signed an agreement.
You want to go first on that and then?
Well, anyway, I mean, the main thing is, after it was a British colony, it was an agreement in 97, and that was the basis on which Britain left. So I think it's not a question of would someone behave differently. It's a question of, are you going to keep the agreement? I mean, they know China knowingly entered into a one country, two systems. And it did it for a reason, part of which was that there was a Western business community there, which was critical for China at that point economically, because investment was filtered through Hong Kong into China, which was the basis of China's great growth. So they needed Hong Kong to be a separate system. They chose that because it was good for China. So now, I mean, for years now, companies have been, since 1919, a lot of companies are moving to Singapore. And I hear from friends that it's speeding up because China now is making a point of trying to make Hong Kong into a Chinese mainland city by integrating it into the region surrounding Hong Kong. And what that basically means is that the corruption which exists in Shanghai, and which is why Shanghai couldn't become Hong Kong, which is what Beijing wanted, is migrating fully to Hong Kong. And once rule of law is no longer respected, companies have a lot of legal troubles in China because the legal system often, if not always, favors the Chinese company. But if there's no more neutral legal system in Hong Kong, and if you can't get free information, there's no benefit for Western companies to base there. You know, if it's going to be just another Chinese city, well, yeah, then go to Shanghai or pick a city wherever your company is doing business. Or if it's your base for Asia, go to Singapore. So I think the question is legitimate, but it doesn't fit the peculiar circumstances under which China wanted to set up that differential.
You want to take the other two questions?
Yeah, well, I'll take the, and we are, I hope, a bit together. So one of the things is I think to think about what the lesson of Hong Kong is in the kind of global affairs is it's Beijing breaking an arrangement that, so the idea should be that how can you trust other kinds of promises that are made? The problem is the US is currently making it less clear that we're willing to keep the global arrangements we do when we say that, you know, if international tribunals say that that people are on the wrong side, we'll occasionally ignore those. I mean, the strongest way to help democracy in any part of the world is to do a better job in our own democracy and do things like when we don't support the UN, when we seem as though we're only going along with the international protocols that break in our favor, then it's perfectly fine to say, for Beijing to say, well, we do that too. So we need to reclaim a kind of effort to reclaim that kind of a moral high ground. In terms of foreign faces, I was really struck by this because one thing we haven't talked about, and this is something that one of the ways that Hong Kong was radically different from any other city in China from 1997 on, was you could be a proud Hong Konger without being ethnically Chinese. You could be from, there's a beautiful essay that the former editor of Time Asia, Zohar Abdul Karam, wrote in 2014 during the Umbrella Movement about my Hong Kong dream. And he said, as he's not ethnically Chinese, but his grandparents have had connections from South, they had been in Hong Kong, that he doesn't know how to read Chinese characters, but he can speak Cantonese. And there was this idea of this kind of cosmopolitanism. And these are the things that are that made Hong Kong very special. And this is something that has gone. And I think that was where it was. So part of the one country, two systems was a kind of place for a really different kind of identity. And I think in our minds about this, and I think about this too with that other question, is there was something like one country, two systems that was then a deal that was then broken. In the 1950s, Tibet was told that it would become part of the PRC, that it would have a high degree of autonomy. It wasn't called one country, but it was very similar. And the Dalai Lama, even for a time, thought it was going to work. He met with Mao. Over time, there was a squeezing out of that. And there was a repression of it. And Tibet became this kind of clearly colonized. And I think we think of Tibet as clearly colonized by Beijing. But the fact that we think of Hong Kong as being inhabited largely by quote unquote Chinese people leads us to not think of it in those same terms. But for many Hong Kongers, they think whether they're ethnically Chinese or not, they think of belonging to a different kind of cultural identity that is being destroyed. And now Hong Kongers in exile are looking to Tibet to try to say, how do we manage to convince the world that we had this special kind of cultural identity, that something was lost? Because I think people do in the West, hasn't helped the Tibetans in terms of political things. But I think if you go around and you talk to an average First you say, isn't it sad what was destroyed and lost in Tibet? There'll be a ready recognition. Whereas with Hong Kong, it takes more work to convince that. So something like that Hong Kong, you could be a Hong Konger without being ethnically Chinese. You could make movies in Hong Kong that weren't the kind of movies you could make somewhere else. You could have the kinds of discussions in public. So all those things are lost. And some of those are much subtler to.
I think we could take one more question if there is. Josh, postdoc from the University of Pennsylvania, Center for the Study of Contemporary China.
Hi there, thanks so much.
I guess I introduced you.
Presentation. Thank you for introducing me, so I don't have to do it myself. We've talked a lot about citizen-state relations, but I'm curious about citizen-citizen relationships vis-a-vis the mainland, because there's a lot of mainland people who engage with Hong Kong who complain that the Hong Kongers look down on them or there's some discrimination. I'm curious, is this something that precedes the movements of 2014 and 2019? And is there a way that those types of relationships, which are inevitable, could sort of be made more productive?
That's another great thing to have on the table. And there were senses of sort of mutual animosity. And there's also generational things are very different in all of these. And I think about going back to the colonial thing, there's somebody who was a close friend of mine who I stopped being friends with during the course of 2019 because we saw it so differently. She was somebody who had lived as being ethnically Chinese under British colonialism and felt so much of the sting from that she was willing to give a lot of leeway toward the possibility. And so it was partly younger Hong Kong people who did not have that memory and did not think of it as much of a shared kind of thing to the mainland. So there was a lot of tension from that, and there was tension also in other ways. And when I talked about this though in some settings, those often will be somebody in the audience who's a young Chinese from Canton or from some other Cantonese speaking place, and says there's another variable in that, which was that there could be a sense of more sympathy for the Hong Kong protests among Cantonese people of the other, and a sense of more being shared. And Mandarin and Cantonese are radically different, so a lot of the way people have talked about the difference now is it's not just that you see foreign faces. You hear a lot more Mandarin, and you hear a lot more pronouncements in Mandarin, and the expectation that the only way that you can get by and get ahead is by Mandarin. There was a movie made in 2015 called 10 Years that imagined a Hong Kong 10 years in the future and was seen as kind of overly dystopian, but a lot of the things have come true. And one was poignant. One was a cab driver who's trying to give directions to his GPS and it won't recognize Cantonese. And that was like a sting of that. And it's imagining a time, and it hasn't happened yet, but this is another case of that erosion.
So to just close on a somewhat, at least, if not positive, open-ended note, one thing we weren't totally clear about in all this discussion of one country, two systems is that from the very beginning, it was only supposed to last 50 years. So one country, two systems was always only the commitment until 2047. So we still have 23 years until 2047. We know where we are in 2024, but let's see what things look like in 2047.